Today, we will continue talking about the second universal maxim, which is al-yaqeen la yazulu bi-shak. Certainty is not displaced by doubt, and I'm going to try and conclude it today. It is, as I said last time, the one that takes the most space in usul al-fiqh and jurisprudence in general. This maxim takes the most space, meaning it covers so many different aspects of jurisprudence that it's just very it's a very versatile maxim, and from it is generated. We have many maxims generated that are generated. And I'm going to share with you a couple of them today, just so that you understand. Now, by the end of this course, what you'll end up having, and this is just to give you a little bit of an understanding of why we're doing this. What you'll end up having is the ability to know what questions you have to ask in order for you to even begin to understand, to formulate a ruling on something. It's the questions that have to be asked at the beginning. Most of those who give rulings and end up being mistaken when they give them is that they didn't know what questions they had to ask to begin with. So they just remembered like a specific hadith or maybe a specific ayah or something, and they thought, oh, this sounds similar to what I'm in, and they went ahead and they slapped a ruling on it. And then but they didn't know that there's a bunch of questions that you have to ask in order for you to utilize the maxims or the principles of Islamic law, and then to know if you need to actually apply more rules to this scenario than maybe just what you thought of. And that's what we're going to try, inshallah, and help you understand. It's just for your ability, bidnillah ta'ala, to feel more, to appreciate the work that goes into making rulings and producing fiqh in general. It's not a simple topic. And I know over the last maybe couple of centuries, a lot of those who are not properly educated took upon themselves to chat about these things, and it had a negative effect on how people perceive fiqh. But no, it's a very important, it's a very powerful and profound science. So some issues of significance regarding this maxim. So first of all, certainty, or what we call that yaqeen, right? And probability, and I'm using that not with the mathematical sense of it, as in it's having probabilities, but as in something that is more probable. Something that is probable, we're going to call it probability here. So we're using the philosophical term, not the mathematical term, which is dhann in Arabic. Both generate rulings in Islam. Both will generate rulings in Islam, but they'll generate different types of rulings with different degrees of significance and different weight when it comes to application. Right? So dhann is less likely to generate a ruling that is going to be obligatory or going to be a pillar, and certainty is more likely to do so. One is more likely to generate a ruling that will be mustahab mandub, meaning something that is recommended. And but both of them will generate rulings for sure. And they have weight when it comes to generate rulings, whether it's certainty or it's high probability, especially when there is accompanying evidence to support a probability. So when you have something that is dhann, meaning you have a probability that's probable, but then you have another piece of supporting evidence that strengthens it, so it takes it to a level that is close to certainty. Close. It may not be full certainty, but it's close enough. And this is an important topic under this maxim, which is something called ghalabatul dhann. Ghalabatul dhann, meaning when you have every reason to think that this is probably the most likely outcome. You can't say 100%, like there's always that, and we know that in medicine a lot, because I'll sit with a patient and I'll say, the most likely outcome from your surgery and your treatment is that this, but I can't swear, I can't say hand to God it's going to happen, because there is the possibility that you end up being harmed by this, but I have a very high probability of belief that this will be the outcome. And that is good enough in life for giving rulings, and it's many times in many senses it's treated like certainty within Islam, unless there is a stronger certainty, there is a full certainty that contradicts it. In that case, then we have to start balancing things out. Probability cannot suffice for certainty in a number of cases, specifically in divorce and in marriage. So because of how sensitive this topic is for the human race in general, not just for Muslims, but for Muslims specifically, as one of the hadiths say, الطلاق جده جد وهزله جد. The serious part of it is serious, and the joke part of it is also serious. Everything is serious when it comes to marriage and comes to divorce. It's just a very sensitive part of life. So in many cases, when it comes to divorce and marriage, you'll find that something that is probable or highly probable doesn't suffice. You need certainty in order for things to work. I'm not going to give you a million examples here. I'm just letting you know that that's an important aspect of understanding this rule because of the sensitivity. The more sensitive things are, the more you need certainty. Similarly in theology. I didn't put that there because I'm trying to mitigate having a verbal fight with someone or later on. In theology, when you use probable pieces of evidence, then you end up in a position where you're asking someone to believe something in certainty, but the evidence to support it was not of certainty. So I'm of the opinion that whenever we're going to present a theological maxim or a theological principle, something that talks about our i'tiqad in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you need the evidence to be of that level of certainty, or else you're asking billions and billions of people from every walk of life all over the planet to the end of time to accept a maxim, a theological maxim, and the evidence was not of certainty. I mean, there was a possibility that there was something wrong in it. And I'm of the opinion, amongst other scholars within modern times and even earlier times, where I don't see that to be, even though the majority may have a different opinion on this topic, but I didn't put it here because I don't want it. This is an issue of aqeedah. When we study a second level aqeedah course, if you will, inshallah, in the next year or so, we'll talk about this topic in more depth and detail. High probability with supporting evidence is treated like certainty in general. And I just put that there as a high probability. So where the probability is 90% and there's supporting evidence, we start treating that as certainty. So when you only have a possibility of this not going right by 1 or 2 or 3% or 5%, we don't, because you can't mitigate that type of risk. But again, in issues of theology and issues of divorce and marriage, it may not suffice. It may not suffice. You may require certainty in order to give a ruling. So an example of where this happens. So if someone gets on a ship and they sail into the sea, and the ship sunk, and we didn't hear back from this person, do we have certainty on their death? Yeah, so certainty we can't. The word certainty, yaqeen, you can't use certainty. You can't. You have ghalabat al-dhann. And you have very good reason to believe this person is dead, right? Because you don't have a body. And it's just, but that high level of probability suffices to say this person died. And what would that mean? Well, that means the wife can go marry someone else and the kids can take their inheritance. Someone's death makes a big difference. So if someone is on a ship and the ship goes into the sea and the ship sinks, right? The qadi will give it a specific amount of time, and like maybe a month. And if the person doesn't show up, even though we don't have certainty, this person may have found himself on washing up on a shore of some island, some far away. There's a 1% possibility this is actually the case, and they're living there. But we go by ghalabat al-dhann. So in certain situations, that high probability suffices for certainty. I had to talk about two things within yaqeen and shak. When we talk about certainty and doubt, and we talk about probability, it comes back to another two words that are important: al-asl and al-zahir. These are very, very important terms, and sometimes they're used interchangeably with their counterparts. So asl is used as instead of yaqeen, and zahir is used instead of dhann or shak. So sometimes they're used depending on the scenario. So al-asl is the default of any given situation, something that is the origin. This is how it's always been. This is what we know about the situation. We call that the default. When things default, what do they default to? What was the origin? How was it beforehand? How was it at the beginning? Al-zahir is the current reality of something, right? So they're a little bit different. There's the asl, how things were initially, the default that we understand and accept, and then the current reality that we see, that is apparent to us. And there's a difference between them. And that difference is important for you to understand, which I'm going to give you some examples here. So for example, two people claim ownership, and one of them has the asset. So the zahir here is whoever has the asset. Since I don't have an asl, to go by, I don't have a default to go by. Both people are claiming ownership of this bottle, but I have it. So unless there's evidence, there is a document of sale where if there's no evidence, a lot of these examples, there's no evidence. That's why we're talking about them. I mean, there's no actual evidence. There's no video of someone buying it. There's no witnesses to say, no, it belonged to fulan and this person stole it. It's just two people out of the blue, and they came out and they said, I don't, and they say, I own this, other person said, I own it. So we don't have an asl to go by. There's no origin, there's no default. So we go by the zahir. The zahir is who has it in their hands. Well, it's theirs until the other person can prove otherwise. And these are important so people understand what it is that they have to document and what it is they have to make sure is apparent. right? So, because once you understand these rulings and how they work, then people start to understand what is it that they have to make sure that they are pursuing for themselves the documentation and pursuing for themselves the proper evidence, because the ruling will not be in their favor if they don't have it. And that's an example. Another example: two people, for example, claim this is very well. I put this here because it's like it's a coined example that every book of Ashbah and Nadha'ir use. When they talk about Asl and Zahir, you always have this example kind of pop up, and it's so common and famous. I would feel that I cheated you out of like an authentic part of Islamic knowledge that I didn't give you the example. And the example is two people. They come on shore on a boat. One of them is a mallah. One of them is a captain of a ship, and the other one is a merchant tajir. And on the ship, and there's a ship, and then there's wheat on the ship. And they're both claiming the ownership of the ship and the wheat. And there's no documents at all. Yeah. And they come to a qadi. So the qadi at that point his judgment would be that the captain owns the ship and the merchant owns the wheat. Because the zahir is that everyone would own the thing that they know how to operate. So the captain operates the ship, so that's probably his. And the merchant knows how to sell wheat, you understand? So he's most likely to operate that. And the same thing goes for a lot of people who are claiming the ownership of certain assets. If two people are claiming that they own this orchard of tuffah, and one of them knows apples, and the other one knows nothing about apples, and there's no there's no documentation, there's nothing to prove. If someone has a piece of paper saying that they own the piece of land, none of this matters. We just use that. But I'm saying if that doesn't exist, then the person who knows more, that's the zahir. I'm trying to explain to you what the zahir is, what seems to be the current reality. Okay. A steward of an orphan, and this is an example that gives you a little bit more understanding of the difference, claims that they spent money on the orphan's estate. So there's an asl here. The asl, the default, is that he didn't spend money, right? You have to prove that you spent money. You can't. The default is not that you're spending money on an estate. The default is that you're not spending your money on someone else's estate. That's the default. So if you're going to claim that you did, then you have to prove that. So what they do is they look at the estate. If the estate has improvements that add up to the amount of money he is claiming, then that's the zahir. And we go with that zahir. And we use that because that's the current reality. This estate was not like this. It is better. He is claiming that he put $50,000, and that is kind of what $50,000 would do to this estate. Then that zahir will trump the asl. But if, for example, he said, I put $1 million on the estate, and we go look at the estate, and the estate has maybe has some work that's done that doesn't go beyond 100K, then he doesn't get the million. You have to, because the asl, because the origin, because the default is that you didn't spend your wealth on someone else's property. And if you're going to prove that, you have to prove that with beyond a shadow of a doubt, right, for it to work. And that's the example. And I put for you this wording that Imam al-Sarakhsi has in his one of the great scholars of the Hanafi madhab, and he puts in his book this really nice wording called "Al-aslu fi bab al-khusumat aw 'inda al-munaza'a an al-qawla qawlu man yashhad lahu al-zahir." So the default in any dispute that exists, that we judge for the one who the current reality is in favor of. Like whatever the current reality is in favor of, we judge for them if we don't have any other evidence. If people bring in unbiased witnesses or they bring in documentation, then that's a different story. Here we're talking about we don't have that evidence and people are it's going by claims. Everyone's claiming something. So how do you, because this happens a lot where two people are disputing and there's only a claim. There's nothing written, there's no documentation. How do we judge? Well, then you always go back to these basic rules. What is the default in this situation, right? Do we have one? We don't have one. Okay, what is the current reality? This is the current reality. Does the current reality and the default go against each other? Do they go against each other? You have to ask that question. Do we not have one of them? What do we have? So you have to kind of differentiate between the two. And I just want you to know that the word asl and the word zahir are important within this line of thinking. So what's examples of al-asl, of the default? So regarding contracts, the origin, the default is that all contracts are permissible unless otherwise stated. Like so you can't say the opposite. Well, this contract, I don't have evidence that it's an Islamic contract, so it's haram until, no, it's the opposite. Any contract is halal unless otherwise proven, unless you can prove to me that there's something batil or fasid or haram in that contract. So that's the default for any contract, right? The default for words is that they will always be understood in their literal form, unless there is a reason for us to understand them figuratively. But we don't default to the figurative meaning of the word. We default to the literal meaning of the word. Is that, I'm just explaining to you, in every discipline of thought, Islamic thought or otherwise, or outside of Islamic thought, there's a default that we always go to in terms, and philosophers understand this. There's always a way that you're going to, this is what you start with, and then you only move away from it if there is supporting evidence or a reason to move away from it. And in wording, the linguistics, it's you always go by the literal. Regarding transactions, that they are final and valid, that they're not mockery. The asl is that when a transaction happens, that was a real transaction. The default is not, oh, we were just joking. If someone says, hey, I'll sell you this for that much, and then someone else comes later offering more money, he's like, I was just joking with you. No. If you sold and I accepted and people watch, the default is that this is a transaction that accept. Again, if you have a piece of paper where people have signed, it doesn't need any of this. But I'm giving you examples where it's just people's words. It's just people's what they're saying. That's why a lot when you document and people write, which is what happened today in the world that we're living in, which makes it doesn't take away the importance of understanding these meanings, but a lot of the examples that are given don't exist as powerfully because a lot is documented, meaning once you sign your name on something, it doesn't matter anymore what you intended. And can you come and say, I didn't read? Well, that's your problem. Who told you not to read? Why did you sign something you didn't read the full? That's your fault. So today, that's why these long contracts with all these details exist, because for the longest time, not only did the Muslim ummah have these struggles to figure out what to do, but also every other group on the planet. So what we evolved into is documentation of everything. And that's what the Quran said, right? إِذَا تَدَيَنْتُمْ بِدَيْنٍ فَاكْتُبُوهُ. Write down everything. Write down everything that you can. But if there isn't evidence of something written, then the word of the human being and what the person said has value. So regarding partnerships, equality. So if I partner up with you on something and we don't say how much you get and how much I get, the default is 50-50. Right? Unless we otherwise, because if we partner up and then after a while you say, yeah, no, we partnered up, but I meant like 10% for you and 90 for me. Like, what? No, you have to say, if you didn't state that, then no, the partnership is always 50-50. I mean, that's the default. These defaults are important. They're important to keep life functioning, or else we run into a lot of trouble. If the default of words is not literal, then Islam as a faith crumbles. It absolutely crumbles. You can't, if the Quran is not understood literally, then khalas, take this off and close this masjid and go, because Islam is just whatever you want it to be. Islam will become whatever you want it to be. Khalas, you sit there and you understand it however you want to understand it. No, there are words, they have meanings, they will indicate certain meanings, and you have to understand these words within those meanings. You can't just decide to understand it some other way. And why? Because the default of linguistics is always understand things literally. Yes. Yeah.
Like things like numbers in the Quran, instead of like specific JLM, we don't understand like things like.
We would still understand it that way, but sometimes the context will be figurative. And again, when you understand things literally, so why would you stop understanding something literally? If you have evidence that that's not what was meant. So what you understand everything that is said literally until there is evidence to support that that's not what was meant here. So that's the study of usul al-fiqh. Yeah. So that question is that question. The answer to that question is taken from usul al-fiqh. So that's إذا تعارض العام والخاص, for example. How do you specify something that is generic, and how do you move from literal al-haqiqa wal-majaz, which is literalism and figuratism? Those two concepts are like a main chapter in usul al-fiqh. How do you move from one to the other? What do you need? What type of evidence? What level of evidence? What if the first one is if the text is in a level A evidence, and the evidence that we're using to move it from literal to figurative is a level B, does it actually function? What examples do you need? How many? So that's that study. That makes sense. I'm not shutting you up. I'm just saying that I want you to understand where things exist, so that you know what to learn and where to learn it. Because everything you're asking is correct. That question was asked. It's a very important question. It's a central question in understanding how to work on Islam. But it's just not the study of maxims. That is when you go back to Usul al-Fiqh, where it explains to you how you extract evidence and then how you have two pieces of evidence deal with one another. How you fuse evidence if they are contradicting each other, if one is generic and one is specific, if one is sarih and one is kina, one is literal, one is figurative. How do you deal with them? There are methods of doing that, and this is where the works of scholars and the work of Usul al-Fiqh comes in. I love this topic, and I'm very biased, but I think people should learn this for sure because it's extremely important. So regarding legal responsibilities, there are none unless otherwise stated. Like, you are not legally responsible unless you're going to be said. It's not that you're responsible until stated otherwise. No, you're not responsible until stated otherwise. And that's an important difference that has to be understood. I'm going to give examples of that, inshallah, as we move along, hopefully today. There are 15 maxims that are generated from this universal maxim. We will explore a number of them due to their significance and importance. I will not go through all 15 of them for sure, but they're a part of for the Arabic reading, they're a part of the reading. For the English reading, they're not all there, but enough of them are there to help. So the first one, al-aslu baqa'u ma kana ala ma kan. So the default or the origin is that things stay as they always were. Right? Unless something came and changed them, things stay the way they were. There has to be something that changes them. It's not the opposite. That the default is that things change, and now we have to prove that they're going to be the way they were before. No, they are the way they were before, unless you can prove to me that something came and changed them. That's a really important piece within Islamic law because it makes a huge difference in how we come up with rulings. And what is known to have been in a certain state or way stays unless there is evidence to counter that. And this is this maxim. It's a wahid min kulliyat, one of the general maxims is derived from this universal maxim, and it has a lot of applications. From this maxim, the scholars of usul ended up making the laws of the nations before us, shar'a min qablana, a source of evidence for us. Because of this maxim that we came up with, we scholars, half of the madhahib at least, see shar'a man qablana, the laws of Ahl Kitab, as a source of evidence for us. If we don't have any other evidence, or we will use that evidence. If we know for sure that that the Yahud or the Nasara believe something and it's universal amongst all of their sects and it's a part of their original beliefs, and we don't have regarding this topic anything, then we would see that as a source of evidence. We would use that. Doesn't necessarily mean we'll practice it, but it's a source of evidence that will be weighed. It will be weighed within the arguments. Because the Prophet ﷺ would do this. And he would do this commonly. And it comes from the fact that al-asl, the default, is that a law that Allah put stays. It's only changed if He changes it. If He didn't change it, then it stays however it was at the beginning. Like unless a new law came and said, did abrogation and say that law is no longer valid, this is now valid because of changes. If nothing abrogated it, then we stick to the initial law. And because of this maxim, we have a full source of evidence in Usul al-Fiqh that is called Shar'a man qablana. And it's weighed in as we are trying to generate rulings. The issue of someone going missing, for example. The asl is that he was alive. So he stays alive until we know otherwise. So if someone's missing, you can't declare them dead within 6 months or within a year. It takes way more than that. Now, a woman can get a divorce, but she has to go to the judge to get a divorce. Like, she has to have the judge divorce her with a khula', right? But she doesn't get a default divorce because he's been away for a year or so. The kids don't get the inheritance until we have certainty or ghalabat al-dhann that the person died. And if we don't have certainty, we think they're still alive, and they haven't been able to make. Of course, back then it was much more difficult to make your way back if you were far away or stranded somewhere. Today it's much easier. But you would have to wait until the person was 90, or halaku aqranihi, meaning all the people of his age passed away, for the judge to declare this person is dead and then give the inheritance. Because if this person comes back and his wealth has been given away and his wife is now divorced and married someone else with other kids, this person's life is destroyed. So, and it goes back to this simple law. Al-asl baqa'u ma kana ala ma kan. The default is that things stay the way they are until we have evidence to change that. And that is a known application of this law. For example, a wife claiming Islam after her husband dies. Let's say, so for the majority of the dhahib, if a person is not Muslim, they don't inherit a Muslim, and vice versa. There are laws that are different for this country, or for this era, especially when we have a lot of converts in a different setup. But in general, these are the laws these are the agreed upon Islamic rulings. So if a wife in Ahl Kitab, she's a Christian or she's a Jew, and she claims after her husband dies that she accepted Islam beforehand, that's revoked. Because what's the asl? What's the default for her? That she wasn't Muslim. So unless she can prove that she changed her deen before he passed away, she can't inherit him. right? And there's a lot of examples where a man does the same thing or something where there's some changes, and right before they try to prove that they did something differently. No, to prove that you did something different, you need actual proof. Like to claim that you did something different, you have to prove that. Otherwise, we're going to go by whatever your default was. And the default in this example that you weren't. So that's another application for this law. There's a second generated maxim. الأصل في الصفات العارضة العدم. The origin or the default for temporary descriptions is non-existence. And for ongoing or essential descriptions is existence. And this is really important. This is where this comes into play in theology a lot, but it's an important maxim. If something, for example, and I'll give you an example so you understand. If I'm going to claim someone is incompetent, so incompetence is a sifa arida, right? It's a moment where it's a temporary description. The asl, meaning the origin, the default, is that people are competent. Adults are competent. That is the default. For me to claim that someone is incompetent, I have to prove that. It's not the default. It's not default. This person is incompetent. They have to prove that they're competent. Imagine if that was the case, that you're incompetent until proven. No, you're competent until proven otherwise. So why? Because incompetence is a temporary description. It's not an essential description. The essential description is that people who achieve adulthood are now responsible for their actions, and they're able to make decisions, and they can take the fruits of those decisions and deal with the consequences of those decisions. But if you're going to claim incompetence, it happens a lot where an elderly. So, for example, claiming receipt of payment or rent. So this is an important one. The origin, the default is that if something is not paid. For it to be paid, that is a temporary thing. Like to pay someone. The default is not that you're paying someone all the time. The default is that you're not giving anyone your money. That's the default. So it's temporary for you to give someone money. So if you're going to claim that you paid for something, then you have to prove that. You have to prove that. So this is important because as a Muslim, then you know what it is that you have to make sure you have documentation of. You have to, if you are living in a house that's not yours, then you have to have the documentation that you're paying the rent. Because Islamically, they can claim that you didn't do it, and then if you don't have documentation, you don't have evidence, then you're the one in trouble. Because the default is not that you paid, the default is that you didn't. And you giving someone your money, that's a temporary description. It's not an ongoing one. So this is a very أصل في الصفات العارضة العدم. This is a very, very profound maxim, and it has applications everywhere. I just chose two of them because I just want you to get a basic understanding of it, but it's applied in a lot of different situations within Islamic law, and specifically in theology. الأصل براءة الذمة. Another extremely important maxim here. So the origin or the default regarding legal responsibility is freedom of liability or freedom from liability. That is the default in Islam. Also that your dhimma is bari. You have a dhimma. The moment you hit adulthood, you have a dhimma, meaning you now can be liable, you can be responsible, you can make decisions. This is what, as a child, you don't have that. You're not liable for anything that you do, and you can't really make decisions, and you can't owe anything. You can't be owed anything. You're a child, right? Aside from the laws that cover childhood in general, you don't have that as an individual, but you fall under a group law. For when you hit adulthood now, you have a dhimma, where you can be held accountable, where you can be made responsible, where what you do will count and matter, whether it's in dunya or in akhirah. So you have a dhimma. That's what dhimma means. And also the default is that your dhimma is bari'a, meaning it is free of liability, unless you're able to prove liability. And from that, if someone claims, for example, returning an entrusted asset or a borrowed asset. So if I borrow something from you and I claim that I returned it, I am believed because al-asl bara'atu dhimmati. The default is that my dhimma is bari'a, that I'm not liable for something. So when it comes to an asset that is borrowed, again, with documentation, that's a different story. When everything is done through documentation, meaning you borrowed it, it was documented, and then it was documented, that's different. But if for example, I borrowed something from you and I claim that I returned it, right? Then that, unless you're able to prove that I didn't return it, then it's actually my qawl, means what I say, my claim that is accepted, because al-asl bara'atu dhimmati. Because if it's not accepted, then I become liable for something. And the default is that we don't make people liable, and that unless we're able to prove that they're liable. Yeah.
If I not borrow anything, then by default I'm free of liability. But if I borrow something, is it that the default now is that I have the possession?
Yeah, you have it in possession. Yeah. But if you claim that you returned it, so you're claiming that you returned it. So what you're doing is you're making a claim that you returned it. So when you claim that you returned it, I go back to the asl. The asl is that every person dhimmatuhu bari'a, unless we can prove otherwise. So if you're claiming that your dhimma is bari'a, I mean your liability, you're not liable for something, then the burden of proof becomes on whoever is going to claim that you're liable for something. So liability is where the burden of proof is. So you took something, we agreed to that, but you're claiming that you're not liable for its presence. You mean you gave it, you're claiming that you're not liable. You're free of liability. So that is the default in Islam. So the other person has to prove that you are liable for something. Yeah. So that's different upon. Yeah, that's different upon. That will be that's left Islamically even back then to the laws of the land. So bulugh is where is the easy answer that I can just get away with by telling you puberty. But the laws of any land will dictate that, and the Islamic law usually goes by whatever the law of the land is dictating. So if the law of the land is seeing it at 18 or 19 or 20 or 21, that's fine. It's not something that it's not something that a Muslim jurist or a Muslim usuli would fight back on. No, it has to be younger. No, even though I think there is value in it being younger. I see that there's a lot of value in it being much younger, because people will behave based on whatever legalities dictate. So if people know that they're not liable until a certain age, then they won't behave until that age, and maybe even beyond that age. So the later you make that age, the more likely you're going to have an immature, unprofessional, unaccountable group of people, and which is a problem for a nation. Like, that's how nations fail, if people take too long to mature and to start taking accountability. So if you make those years earlier, again, I'm not saying they have to be ridiculously early, like 12 and 13, but I think pulling them back is not a bad idea, if of course with that comes a campaign of awareness, a campaign of education. This is a very complex topic, but I'm just saying in general that's how it's looked like. The final, another piece that's really simple, is any accusation in Islam requires evidence beyond a reasonable doubt in order for the accused to be liable. And this is way before the Western court systems came up with this phrase. So they have to have ghalabat al-dhann. So yaqeen or ghalabat al-dhann is what we have to have. And ghalabat al-dhann means beyond a reasonable doubt, meaning I'm certain, not 100%, but beyond what is reasonable in terms of doubting. You're talking 1% or some weird, something that's very, very unlikely to happen. Only then can I hold someone accountable. Otherwise, people are liable. People aren't liable. So if someone's being accused of murder, accused of theft, we cannot hold that person accountable until we have overwhelming evidence that is the case. Otherwise, it's the liability becomes on the person who accused them. Because now that person can argue that my reputation was one thing, and then you said that, now you're repeating something else. And I can prove that you're liable for that because you made that accusation publicly. So it's a big deal when it comes to accusing people of stuff, which is why it's important in Islam that we guard our possessions and we guard our integrity, our arad, and we guard all that which is important to us, and we're very careful with who we let access it, and then because once you let when things become loose, then people can do stuff, and you can accuse, and then taking someone's possession is horrible. Accusing someone of taking your possession is equally horrible. It's equally bad. So it's a big deal Islamically, because the asl bara'atu dhimma. That's why. لا عبرة للدلالة في مقابلة التصريح. There's no significance for the implicit in the presence of the explicit, and that's similar to talking about literal and figurative meanings. But this is like the maxim that is generated from that. And someone asked, for example, permission to enter someone's home and drank from a cup of water in the house. Like, it's implied that when you offer me entrance into your house, that you're okay with me drinking from a cup of water. Let's say I pick up the cup and I drank and it fell and it broke. Am I liable for that? So unless you explicitly told me, do not touch that cup of water, I'm not. Like, unless you explicitly told me, do not touch that cup, and I go enter your house and I pick up the cup and I break it, then I'm liable. But if not, well, I didn't give you permission. You didn't have to. It was implied. That permission is implied. When I enter your house, implied that I'm going to be able to access basic needs like drinking water, going to the bathroom. And these things again are understood through the ada, and we'll talk about. And that's a separate universal maxim that I'm going to share with you very, very soon. But the idea here is that I'm just talking about explicit and implicit. There are things that are implied, right? Though we accept those until there is something that is explicitly said. So another example is the silence of the seller, so not of the lambs, but of the seller. If there's a seller who, if I come and I put money on the table, I'm a seller, and you put money on the table, you take this and you walk away. If I'm silent, I'm implying that I'm okay with this transaction. I can't say later on that I wasn't okay with it, right? If I yell out that I don't sell it with that amount of money, and I was joking or I was saying that just to make you feel that I gave you a deal, you have to come back because I explicitly said I wouldn't sell it that money, and the explicit will always beat the implicit. So this transaction is not valid. You have to come back and make sure that I was actually okay with it, and I was only saying that to make you feel good, right? Because the explicit will always trump the implicit. Does that make sense? So these little things matter in transactions and in general life. So for example, the bride, if the father is talking to her about fulan and she laughs and she smiles, which is ridaha yani samtuha, for example. In the Islamic, if she's quiet but she smiles, then that's an implicit, it's an implied acceptance for her. But if she smiled and did that but then said explicitly I don't want him, then we don't go by the implicit, right? Like we don't go by the implied understanding that, oh well, you smile at the beginning. Maybe she laughed in mockery. Maybe she thought it was absolutely ridiculous that you thought she would marry this person. It doesn't matter. The explicit is clear. When she says no, that's clear. Does that make sense? So we have to kind of watch out for these. And there's a lot of examples in Islamic law that explain this. I'll be done in a moment. من شك هل فعل شيئا أو لا فالأصل أنه لم يفعله. So he who doubts whether they performed an action or not, they default to not having performed it always. So if you're like, did I do it or not do it? The default is you didn't do it, because the default is we're not doing anything. We're sitting around. We're just mammals lying on our bellies, waiting for a reason to get up and do something. So the default is not that you did something. The default is that you didn't do something. So whether someone divorced his wife or not, and this is like funny, interestingly enough, an issue in fiqh that happens a lot. Not because it's important, but because people's lives. If you live in my, if you lived in my shoes for a day, you'll understand that these things matter. Like for you sitting there, you're reading this, like what is stupid. No. You don't live in my position. You don't see the type of questions we get on a daily basis. You don't see what actually people are asking. And if you did, you understand that these are important topics to exist in books of fiqh, because you get these type of claims where I can't remember. Well, the also is that you didn't do it. Yeah, and Allah take at this. But that's what. So doubted whether he forgot something obligatory in prayer or did something extra. So there are different situations. If you forgot whether you prayed this rak'ah or not, then the default is what? You didn't pray it, right? If you forgot whether you did an extra thing or not, then the default is what? That you didn't do it. So if you're like, I'm not sure if I did an extra rak'ah, you didn't do it. Because the default is you didn't do it. But I can't remember if I did the fourth rak'ah or not. Then you have to get the fourth rak'ah, because the default is that you didn't do it. So when it comes to doubting whether you did something extra or less, it changes because it goes back to the default. The default is that you didn't do something, not that you did do something. Yeah, same thing. But in wudu, so the example that we always give is if you can't remember if you did wudu or not, then you didn't do it. You go make it. But if you can't remember if you lost your wudu or not, then the default is you didn't lose it. Right? And to say we've talked about that at the beginning of this. It's the same idea coming from the same origin. الأصل في الأشياء الإباحة حتى يدل الدليل على التحريم عند الجمهور وعند أبي حنيفة الأصل فيها التحريم حتى يدل الدليل على الإباحة. So I like this topic because Abu Hanifa has his own opinion on this matter that the Hanafis don't follow. Just to understand, Abu Hanifa's madhab is not Abu Hanifa's opinions. Abu Hanifa was a genius. He built the madhab through people. Like he had his students build the madhab. He gave his opinions on stuff, but his opinion rarely, like most of the time, you'll find in the Hanafi madhab, قال أبو حنيفة كذا, and then والمذهب كذا, and what the madhab actually is this opinion. But they always, out of respect, will put the opinion of the scholar. But he built a madhab where it wasn't based on him. It was based on a methodology, which is why his madhab lived on for so long and spread so far, because it's not based on a person's idea. It's based on a methodology of thought. The other madhab, we figured out what their methodology is later, because it was based on one person's opinion, if that makes sense. But Abu Hanifa from the beginning, his madhab was a methodology. It wasn't his. Anyways, that's something for usul fiqh we can talk about. So the origin of the default state of things is that they are permissible until stated otherwise. Abu Hanifa specifically said the opposite. For example, eating unknown animals. There's no evidence regarding whether this animal is edible or not. The default is that it's permissible until you can tell me otherwise. Food, drink, clothing, behaviors. The default for all these things is that they're permissible unless you can prove to me explicitly that they are not permissible. So wearing certain clothing, drinking certain beverages, eating certain food, acting in certain ways, right? These things, in order for us to say it's haram, we have to have evidence to say that. Otherwise, they're permissible. And there's a problem with this among scholars. Where anything that's weird, we immediately say that's not what we're used to. No. Islamically, the asl fil fiqh is no, it's permissible unless you can tell me why it's not permissible. Give me a good reason. Meaning, you have to show me evidence why this specifically. There's a good reason why it's not permissible. Otherwise, it's going to be open. The exception to this is in rituals, sexual relations, and daba'ih. So the daba'ih specifically, whether you can eat dabiha or not, the asl is that it's not until you can prove that it was slaughtered in the Islamic way. When it comes to sexual relations, same thing. The default is that it's not permissible unless you can prove that it's permissible with your certificates of marriage and people. And the same thing goes for rituals. The default is that you can't come up with something new. You have to follow what was given before. So those are the exceptions that the scholars all, again, sensitive stuff. Sensitive stuff, they end up having exceptions to some of these rules. Yes. Yeah. That was his opinion, but the Hanafis, they don't necessarily have this opinion within the madhab, but that was his opinion. It's a really interesting opinion. I would love to sit down and dissect why he said that, but it's going to take forever. But it's something worth looking into. I'm just trying to provoke a little bit of thought for you and to look into this. And that's the last one. So that I'll end with that, inshallah ta'ala. Next week we'll start the third universal maxim, which is the mashaqqa tajlibu at-taysir. So prepare, kind of read up on that a little bit so that you can follow along with the content. Subhanallahi bihamdihi, la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Jazakumullahu khairan wa barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala.